week where Palestinian leaders have been snubbing the Trump administration over what they see as its pro-Israel bias. Last month, the Palestinians stayed away from a U.S.-sponsored conference in Bahrain that focused on the economic side of the peace plan. Further complicating matters is the upcoming election in Israel, and it's said the U.S. is holding off on the rest of the peace plan until a new government is in place. I'm Lawrence Rifkin, SRN News, Jerusalem.
More details at themedialine.org and srnnews.com.
Let's get it started in here.
The viewpoints of J. Michael McCoy, his co-hosts, guests, and callers are not necessarily those of any particular religion or denomination. They may or may not be the views of Webcast One Live, the cleaning guy, the woman who brings in cookies, the parking valet, the staff of The View from a Pew, Jill King, Lucinda, the graphic design lady, Justin, Bob, Brian, Linda, or anyone else of sound mind or questionable mental capacity. Should you be offended, provoked, triggered, intimidated, shocked, confused, or inspired to think independently, call our studio lines at 515-442-KPOG and join the conversation. After all, it's your voice we want to hear. Now, live from the Jordan Crossing Studios, here's your host,
Frank the Verse Thomas.
Provoked, triggered. Now you're speaking my kind of language. That's just the kind of words I like, provoke and trigger. I am Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from a Pew, and let me see, let me get my volumes up here. See if I'm, think that's okay. All right, so anyway, this is Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from a Pew. And we're heard every day, Monday through Friday, 4 to 6 p.m., and that's at Jordan Crossing Church, and that's at the...
Live from the Yellow Blue Studios, your home for the light from LED Lighting. This is KPOG Grimes, West Des Moines.
And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, to give me your input, feedback on stories you like, stories you don't like, things you want to hear, you can do so by following these simple instructions.
We want to hear from you, so give us a call on the Service Legends Talk and Text line, 515-442-5764. That's 515-442-KPOG.
And we're going to get to our lesson study here at after 5:30. And our study for today is do something, God. You ever said that? You ever challenge God? God, what are you doing? Do something, please. Well, we're going to talk about that today at 5:30. And, of course, it's Monday, and we catch up with our Sabbath and Sunday lessons. So that is today's lesson, do something, God. And then we have Sabbath and Sunday before we get to that. Then I'm going to, I've talked about this topic before, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it again. I'm going to talk about William Miller. Who was William Miller? Why should anybody know the name William Miller? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about William Miller and the Millerite movement today, and some things I read over the weekend that just kind of opened my eyes that, like they hadn't been opened before. I always knew things of this nature, but now I know what the word soon means, and I'll explain if you stay with us till we discuss William Miller. And until then, I've got some breaking Christian news stories that I would like to share with you, and I think these things are you'll find enlightening. And as I said, if there's something you would like to comment on, you don't like the story, you like the story, feel free to call me at the Service Legend Talk text line and tell me what you think of the story. You like, dislike, thumbs up, thumbs down. 515-442-5764. Here's a United Kingdom, or as they say, UK, United Kingdom psychologist who worked at Child's Trans Clinic, that would be short for transgender clinic, bravely sounds alarm in damning open letter to former boss. Quote unquote. Puberty blockers are not fully understood. Okay? Now, if you are a layman like me, they are giving kids, they have camps. I've seen this on cable TV. And they have camps for as children as young as, I believe, 6 years old. The camps are, 6 to 15 something. Can't remember the exact age range of the camps, but I think it starts at 6. To counsel, encourage, give hormone blockers, etc. Now, I don't know if they start the hormone blockers as young as 6, but this is basically blocking puberty. And blocking, so if you're a young girl, they would be blocking your estrogen and your hormones and your things that would lead to menstruation. With boys, they would be blocking the testosterone and the things that would denote maleness. Now, the way I understand, and I'm not a medical professional here and didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn last night, but I understand that I believe that men and women both have estrogen and testosterone. But women have testosterone in much lower levels than men, and men have estrogen in much lower levels than women. But we both, supposedly, I think, to my understanding, we both have those hormones in our body. And so these hormone blockers would block estrogen. It would be after blocking menstruation in women, breast development, and I suppose in men it may block testicle development and enhance, maybe breast development in boys. I don't know all the technical wherefores of it, but it's blocking our general development of our normal male-female hormone levels. I've also seen accounts of young people who no longer identify as transgender even after medical intervention and now are distressed about having been put on a medical pathway. It is by seeing their courage that gives me the courage and the ethical duty to speak up. This is by Kirsty Entwistle, psychologist, from an excerpt of an open letter she wrote to Dr. Polly Carmichael. A psychologist who worked at the UK's only clinic that offers sex change services to children has raised serious concerns about the work conducted at the facility. Kirsty Entwistle, a clinician, worked at the Gender Identity Development Service in Leeds, I suppose that's London, which is operated by Tavistock Centra, a London-based clinic that offers services to young people who are thinking about transitioning to a different gender. The publicly funded clinic is for children and young people and their families who experience difficulties in the development of their gender identity. It's the only one of its kind in Britain, according to the website. Now, however, as it takes on a soaring number of young patients, the facilities come under increased scrutiny in a damning open letter. What kind of letter? Damning open letter. written to Tavistock Service Director Dr. Polly Carmichael, Entwistle says she sought to outline her grave, quote, concerns surrounding the ongoing work of the GID, which stands for, okay, where did I read it? Gender Identity Development Service, so GIDS. Including dishonesty on behalf of clinicians as to the wide-ranging impact of gender transition can have on young people. None of this stuff's been studied. This is not studied science. They're flying by the seat of their pants here, I'm telling you. I mean, you start messing with somebody's natural hormone level, you're messing in an area you don't even have any idea what you're doing. I mean, it takes years upon years for the FDA to test and certify certain drugs to come online. And they're going to hit your kids up with hormone blockers and stuff that they have no idea the repercussions of what they're doing. She says, I think it is a problem that GIDS clinicians are making decisions that will have a major impact on children and young people's bodies as well as their lives, potentially the rest of their lives, without robust evidence base. But they don't care. That's the point. They don't care. They're in a haste to redefine everything. They're redefining marriage. The Sabbath's already been redefined. They're trying to redefine gender. They're trying to redefine what it literally means to be male or female. They're trying to redefine our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights. They're trying to redefine language. They're trying to take words out of the vernacular. They're trying to change terminology. For example, I mean, a boy by definition can't be raped. He can be sexually assaulted. He can be sodomized. There's all kinds of things a boy can be, but he can't be raped because rape denotes vaginal intercourse. By definition, it can't happen, but because they're trying to take away this gender identity for anyone, they're clumping everything into the same thing. So, they cry women's rights when they want women's rights, and then they try to say men and women are interchangeable parts. You can't have it both ways. Politicians like Kirsten Gillibrand and Kamala Harris and Hillary Clinton and these different ones, they want to advocate that there's no difference between men and women. But then they want, like Kirsten Gillibrand wants to claim that she's a poor, downtrodden young mother, and the woman is 52 years old. How do you claim to be a young mother at 52? In addition, the psychologist noted that workers were constantly assuring children and their families that the administering of puberty blockers and the effects thereof are fully reversible. The reality, however, is that the effects of these drugs are still not fully understood. GIDS clinicians tell children and families that the blockers and the hormone blocks are fully reversible, but the reality is no one knows for sure if they're reversible or not. What the impacts on the children's brain is and how it's possible to make this claim. I mean, supposedly women, women use one side of their brain that men don't, and vice versa. So no one knows the impact on developing child development with this situation. This is an inexact science. But in the haste to redefine everything that is God and the natural things that he put into order, when's it going to be when, I don't know, the lion evolves enough to go into a courtroom and claim, well, I feel like a horse today. In fact, the male lion wants to be a female horse. I don't know. It's just that silly. You know, I've often joked, they talk about evolution. Well, why did we stop evolving? If animals really have rights, when is the gazelle going to step up into the courtroom, go to the county attorney and file charges and for the lion that bit off his hindquarter and now he can't provide for his family or make a living? When are they going to put that lion on trial for murder? When are they going to put the shark on trial for biting the seal, the tail end of the seal off? And is the lion going to be given a public defender, a public defense attorney? I mean, this stuff is ridiculous. You got to understand, nobody knows this stuff. But if we really evolved from animal, why did all of a sudden animals stop evolving? And I want to see the day we go into a courtroom and the gazelle is suing the lion for damages and wants restoration of his leg and damages for the loss he's incurred. I mean, this is how ridiculous. There's science involved here. There should be science involved here. But when it comes to gender, the atheists, like my good old friend Christian, agnostic more precisely, where is the science in all of this, brother? We're just going to take someone's word for it based on feelings, and children don't even have, and the peer pressure's got to be immense. If all your friends are saying, well, hey, this is the cool thing to do, to say you're a girl or to say you're a boy and you're transitioning and you're getting peer pressure to do something, and they say a lot of these kids who are claiming this change their mind at some point. We have to have something more solid than based on feelings. I'm sorry. You know, a young man wants to go in, with raging testosterone, and he decides, well, hey, I'm so hard up, I would like to claim I'm a woman so that I can go in and be a voyeur in the woman's shower facilities, the women's shower and locker room facilities. Should we let that go unchallenged as a society? We don't know the veracity of someone's claim. We can't prove the veracity of someone's claim by science. Science? And that was air quotes for those of you on the radio. I said it twice because I raised my fingers and was doing the air quotes. For those who are watching on Facebook feed. I mean, this stuff, I don't know. It just Lord, come soon. And we're going to talk about the Lord coming soon. If you hang with me, we're going to talk about the Lord coming soon much later in the show. But here is a medical doctor who breaks down the complexities of the human body that prove God. When you really stop and take one step back and consider how enormously complex the body is, there's no possibility it could be an accident. That's by Dr. Tommy Mitchell. Well, I read that story to you last week that talked about how medical researchers was confounded by what the sac of fluid was surrounding the heart, and they've now discovered that it may have healing cells in it that help regenerate heart muscle. And as I went off on a diatribe last week, what else regenerates itself? To the chagrin of, again, my agnostic and atheist brothers and sisters. I got a friend, Christian, who I don't know if I won't say he. Well, I say he's graduated from Iowa State. He's taken a 2-year degree for something out in Virginia Tech, and he's now going to go to Canada and take some schooling. He's, roughly 35 years old. I kind of joked and laughed with him the other day. When you get all this education and you pay off all your debts, how much actual years are you going to have to bask in this education and make some money? And he, kind of laughed and said, not much. When are you going to actually make some profit? You're going to make money, but you're going to be paying off college loans and college debts. And how much, at what point are you ahead of the game? And then how much time are you going to have to live before you die? And like King Solomon said, vanity, it's all vanity, chasing after the wind. What do you have once you think you've got a hold of the wind? What do you got? Your hand's empty when you open it. Yeah, man, I reached up there and I grabbed some wind and I opened my hand to look at it. Well, where'd it go? So, to the chagrin of my friend Christian, we're all aging. We're all dying. What else regenerates itself? I mean, creation screams God, even in its fallen, unpristine state. It screams God. Imagine what it looked like before it was fallen and when it was in its pristine condition. It oozed and screamed God. But Dr. Tommy Mitchell's gone through a spiritual evolution. The medical doctor who once embraced theistic evolution is now a young earth creationist. Imagine that. Neil deGrasse High Tyson, another set of air quotes, note high. And I say that because there was let me see if I can find that. It was a television series on Nickelodeon, I believe, deGrasse High Cast. deGrasse Junior High. It was follows the exploits of Canadian youngsters in the late 80s. The first soap opera for kids, deGrasse High doesn't sugarcoat the problems facing Canadian or American youth. It was first episode was January 87, final episode 89, if that's the one I'm thinking of. But it was, well, then here's one that runs from 87 to 91. I'm thinking there was a newer version of this deGrasse High because I'm thinking it was more into the 2000s, but this could be it. May have just been a replay. But Neil deGrasse High is a physicist. And he's a professor at Harvard, a physicist. This guy is a very smart individual. And let me see if I can, let me just see if I can find him just to tell you who he is. Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now, he is, if you remember, he is the narrator of Cosmos. You know, that series that was on Fox. I think it was on Fox a couple of years ago. But old Neil, he's a astrophysicist, author and science communicator. And he is, his education is from Columbia. University of Texas at Austin, and he's a Columbia University graduate. I believe he's a Harvard professor at this point, I believe. Let's see. Anyway, he's a smart guy. Here, let me check this out one more time. Okay, I believe, well, okay, here he's got an education of Harvard University. He's got a BA from Harvard. He was, he's an astrophysicist, and he done the show Cosmos. Okay, so he has my sister's birthday. That's amazing. October 5th, 1958. He's 60 years old, so he's my age. I'm September of 57, so I'm a little older than he is. But I didn't know he shared my sister's birthday. Interesting. So the point that I wanted to bring up by saying all of this is Neil deGrasse High, emphasis high, as in marijuana high, said on Bill Moyers one night that a young Earth creationist should not be allowed to vote. Wait a minute. Hold on. Did I hear what I think I heard you say, verse? Someone that believes that the Earth is only a little less or more than 6,000 years old should not be allowed to vote. Well, Neil deGrasse High Tyson, I guess me and you's exactly equal. Because I exactly believe that an old earther shouldn't be allowed to vote either. So that leaves nobody to vote. But we are deniers, because we don't buy into the idea that dinosaurs predated original sin, and that dinosaur bones and things that have been found, and they found dinosaurs eating other dinosaurs, which would denote cannibalism amongst dinosaurs, that somehow murder and cannibalism predated Adam and Eve's original sin, the Garden of Eden. And of course, they base all this on their C14, carbon 14 testing, to which I would say, when the Word of God conflicts, when your science conflicts with the Word of God, go back and re-examine your science. That's just me. That's the opinion of Frank the Verse Thomas. Go back and re-examine your science, because your science is wrong. The world was created in 6 days. The Bible's clear. And those 6 days are not indeterminate time periods of time which no one knows. Maybe the creation day was 1,000,000 years. No, God spoke into existence. It didn't take him 1,000,000 years to speak what was in existence on day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and then rested on the 7th. But Mitchell recently shared his story on an episode of Pure Flix, answering atheists, focusing on some important details that convinced him of the complexities of the surrounding the human body. He also shared why he believes many doctors overlook these realities. Read also Who Created God? Author responds to atheist burning question. Most of the doctors I worked with for years and years and years were atheists, he said. This whole issue of the complexity of the body just doesn't really come up because you're so busy taking care of grandma. You don't sit back and go, the heart or the kidney or whatever is so wonderful. And again, I've shared this a few times. but it's worth sharing again. And I can't provide you the source for it, only that I've read it, I've heard it. But the researchers that I attribute to hearing it and reading it from said that the heart is such a simple but yet effective organ and such a simplistic pump and design, they literally can't understand why it should ever stop working. Because it was never meant to stop working. And as I said last week, I challenge that pump up against any pump. How about the pump in your refrigerator that's pumping refrigerant? How about the pump in your air conditioning in your automobile? How about your sump pump that keeps the water out of your basement? Pick a pump of any kind. I challenge any pump to last 100 years, but yet many men live to be 100. I think the oldest person in the world living right now, maybe she just died, but I thought one of the oldest living people was 113. But there's many people, 106, 108, But imagine a pump lasting 100. Imagine a man-made pump lasting 108 years. It's really unheard of. But yet we have a pump in our heart that's just a muscle. And it has some valves and some things in it that help us to live. And that pump is so simple in design and so effective in design that they can't understand why it should ever wear out, because it should never wear out. And that's just the heart. We have the kidneys and the liver, the lungs. When you stop and consider the complexities of the body, whether it's homeostatic mechanisms that allow temperature to remain constant, or acid-base levels to remain within very tight limits, or the way the kidney helps regulate blood pressure and the fluids balance of blood clotting proteins, they all have to be exactly in the same place at exactly the right concentrate, or a small cut on your finger would cause you to bleed to death. It's compelling. When you really stop and take one step back and consider how enormously complex the body is, there's no possibility it could be an accident. We have inside of our bodies, as sinful and rebellious and wicked and decaying as they are, we have things in there, our immune system, we have things that start the healing process, we can regenerate new white blood cells, we can do all kinds of miraculous things in our body, and somebody wants to chalk that all up to accident. The doctor also spoke about his transformation from theistic evolution to young earth creationism. Wow! I applaud you, brother. Young earth creationism, that's where it's at, because the world was created in 6 days and God rested on the seventh. That's why I honor every seventh day. Elseways, if there was a 1,000-year period that the world was created, I'd only honor a Sabbath every 7,000 years, and I'd never see one in my life. But God says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the seventh is the day of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. The doctor spoke about his transformation to a young earth creationist, noting that the change of heart required some unlearning of a lot of things he had been taught. So he had to deprogram. Here's a very smart man saying, I got to deprogram a bunch of junk that I once thought I knew. I'll says here, who created God? Author responds to atheist burning question. Atheists tend, I'll just share it with you, it's not too long. You're listening to Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from a Pew. This is KPOG 102.9 FM. Atheists tend to wage a number of common critiques against God and the Bible. Among the most frequent qualms is the question, well, if God created everything, well then who created God? It's a curiosity that Bodie Hodge, an author and speaker and researcher, Answers in Genesis, is all too familiar with, and one that he has an intriguing response. They're assuming that time is absolute and God shows up on that timeline somewhere. That's not the God of the Bible, Hodge said. The God of the Bible is creator of all things, including time. God is not bound by time. He's outside. He created time. And he can walk in and out the bounds of our reality. See, we have laws that govern our nature. We have gravity. We have things that keep us in balance. God can walk in and out of those bounds of our reality. He's not confined to the box we want to put him in. The author added that he believes some people mistakenly look at God as some sort of created God, when in fact he's the creator of all things and is not bound by the rules that he set into motion. Exactly what I just shared. Hodge defended the veracity of the Bible, the Christian holy book that atheists critique as being filled with myths and contradictions. Hodge pushed back against those who question Scripture. The Bible is the most attested ancient work we have. Nothing even remotely comes close. The Bible is the Bible full of contradictions? No, not at all. If we actually start looking at those, alleged contradictions, you know what we find? They're not really contradictions. Watch Hodge discuss the alleged contradictions and why he believes the Bible is. So there is some videos associated with this. But God is Alpha, God is Omega. No beginning, no end. So everything we know has a beginning. Nothing come from nothing. As somebody once said, a watch denotes a watchmaker. And then you have the ontological argument, which is the hardest argument for an atheist to refute, and that would be the idea that without God, an atheist by definition can't exist. An atheist has to rely on God for the very definition of its existence. I don't believe in God. Well, if you don't believe in God, if there's no God, then you couldn't possibly have a belief in no God. So there has to be God. There has to be a God for there even to be the concept of God. And furthermore, counterfeit, for there to be something counterfeit, there has to be something real. So, for example, if you are a New York Yankee fan, or you're a Los Angeles Laker fan, or you're some sporting team fan, and somebody's trying to sell you some counterfeit Yankee gear or some counterfeit Los Angeles Laker gear, and I'll even throw in New England Patriots, so I'll cover baseball, football, and basketball. But say you've got your favorite football, baseball, basketball team, you know what counterfeit gear is. Well, the counterfeit gear can't exist without the real thing. There can't possibly be counterfeit Los Angeles Laker gear unless there's a real Los Angeles Laker team. So I would argue man can't even come up with these concepts on his own. God has to exist for there to be an atheist. And even the concept of God can't exist without a real God, because who could make up the concept of God if there wasn't a God? That would be the ontological argument, which would be the hardest argument for atheists to refute. But even more so than that, there's the lower arguments of a watchmaker, or a car maker. A car can't exist without a car maker. Watch can't exist without a watchmaker. So the argument would come down to this. You come home in the evening and there's a zebra in your kitchen, and you ask your wife, well, how in the world did this zebra get in our kitchen? And she says, well, I don't know. It just came from nothing. Well, nothing comes from nothing. So the argument would be, well, where'd the matter come from for where did the atoms, where'd the Big Bang, where'd the quantum flatulence, whatever you want to call it, where did those materials come from to slam into each other, to bang into each other, to create everything we know? Nothing comes from nothing. You can't get nothing from nothing. So then their argument be, well, okay, let's concede there is a creator. Then they want to ask you the obvious question, well, where'd God come from? Well, it's just as easy to believe in a God as it is to believe nothing came from nothing. Now, I can't tell you where God came from. That's beyond my pay grade, and I have no ability to tell you where God came from. But the fact I can't tell you where he came from doesn't mean he doesn't exist. So, here's a couple of stories I'm just going to hit, not get too deep into them. But I thought this was kind of a cool story. President Trump surprises bride and groom at a wedding reception. The leader of the free world is at our wedding. We're all proud Americans. The response was amazing. The energy in the whole ballroom was unbelievable. Even the staff said they had never seen a wedding with such energy. Donald Trump is standing between the bride and groom taking a picture. I think that's pretty cool. What would you do if President of the United States crashed your wedding and showed up and said, hey, give me a picture of the bride and the groom? That'd be pretty, that would be something you'd never forget in your lifetime. You'd be telling your kids and your grandkids, or your kids would be telling your grandkids, and your grandkids would be telling your great-grandkids. That would be pretty cool. I mean, just imagine, if the world lasted long enough, but back in the day, people will have a letter from Abraham Lincoln, or, imagine if Abraham Lincoln crashed somebody's wedding and somebody's telling their kids and their grandkids. And, the only claim to fame that I've got is supposedly the one claim to fame I got is my mother got invited to sit in the back of Elvis's limo when he was here in about 1956 at, I think, the KRNT Theater or wherever it was at the time. And she got to give Elvis a kiss. Elvis thought she was pretty cute. And my mom said, well, I bet you tell that to all the girls. But, imagine having a story to tell your kids and your grandkids that the President of the United States crashed your wedding. Here's a story that kind of boggles the imagination, but 32 million Americans think Apollo 11 was staged on a sound stage. My great aunts Daisy and Clara were convinced that humans never went to the moon. I asked them about the television broadcast we all watched. They claimed it was filmed by Hollywood actors on the sand dunes in Arizona. I asked them about the testimony of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin that they had been to the moon. They said that the astronauts had been paid to lie. I asked them about the moon rocks they brought back. How do you know they're from the moon? My great aunts were not alone in their skepticism. A poll taken a year after Apollo 11 found that 30% of Americans believe the moon landing to be fake. Even today, as many as 10% of Americans, and that's 60% of Russians and 25% of Brits, believe the lunar landing was staged. 10% of Americans equates to 32 million people. That's more than the population of our 15 largest cities combined. Even though scientists have repeatedly debunked such conspiracies, they persist and they tell us something about faith in our culture. Trust in government peaked at 77% in October 1964, a year after President John F. Kennedy's assassination. The year before the moon landing, average trust in government had fallen to 62%. The year after the landing, when 30% of Americans believe Apollo 11 to be staged, the government had fallen further to 54%. Trust in public government today stands at 17%. I think at the time, I think it was at the time of the Kennedy assassination, I want to say that, oh man, I don't, if you know, I don't want to talk out of turn here, but I think it was something like 6 or 7 out of every 10 Americans polled at the time believed that Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone. So there was some sort of conspiracy to the Kennedy assassination, and that number's only increased over the decades. People in 2019 don't trust their government. If you think Donald Trump's popularity numbers are bad sometimes, which they're not, and I think they're being underreported, but take a look at Congress's approval ratings, it's about 11%. Trust in the church and organized religion has fallen as well. From 1973 to 1985, American confidence in religion was at 60%. Today, only 38% of Americans say they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the church as an organized religion. So, it's of course, and part of this is not only that, but I would guess just from my layman's knowledge, I would guess the vast majority of people that believe that the Apollo 11 and the different things were staged would be people under quote unquote the flat earth theory. And now we have a story. Pastor David Jeremiah warns that churches are too focused on numbers and entertainment. That's butts in the seats, that's offerings, that's tithes, that's the thing, and entertainment. David Jeremiah warned that too many churches in the United States have, quote, forgotten why they exist and focus. And I want to explain to you why. If you've listened to anything I've had to say on this program, pay attention to the end of this program when I talk about William Miller. Because I'm going to explain to you exactly why David Jeremiah is right here. Too many churches in the United States have forgotten why they exist and focused on entertainment and social issues instead of focusing on the things the Bible tells them to focus on. He says pastors should be focused on spiritual disciplines that makes the church healthy rather than being preoccupied with numbers and techniques that will make it grow numerically. Don't worship at the attendance altar. So in other words, rather than a faithless thousands, I'd rather have a faithful few. And as my friend Christian chagrins when I say this, or to the chagrin of my friend Christian when I say this, I told him a number of times of the evangelist that said, I'd rather have sheer ignorance on fire than all the education you can put in this auditorium on ice. And notice I say ice. God's not against having knowledge and intelligence working for him. It's the knowledge and education on ice that's no good. Be glad to have a lot of smart, intelligent people on fire for the Lord, but sadly it seems only like the ones who can accept God in the simplest of faith seems to be the ones who are most on fire for the Lord. The people who are so smart are too smart to believe in God and too smart to tell others about Him. So I'll tell you why David Jeremiah is right when we talk about William Miller later. Then I just wanted to mention this here real quick, because as you know, Saturday was the, along with being the Sabbath, July 20th was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing and Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. And then, of course, you had Michael Collins that wasn't there. But I think this is kind of cool. Your smartphone, the smartphone you hold in your hand, is millions of times more powerful than all of NASA's combined computing in 1969. You hold in your hand more technology than it took to put a man on the moon and get him back to Earth. That's the year man first set foot on the moon. It's really difficult to imagine the technical challenges of landing on the moon more than 5 decades ago if you're not a rocket scientist, but what's certain is that computers played a fundamental role even back then. Despite NASA's computers were pitiful by today's standards, they were proper enough to guide humans across 356 kilometers of space from Earth to the moon and return them safely. In fact, the first Apollo missions, critical safety and propulsion mechanism controlled by the software were used for the first time, which formed the basis for modern computing. Essential to the lunar missions was now an ancient command module designed at MIT called Apollo Guidance Computer. The computer used an operating system which allowed astronauts to type in pronouns and verbs. It controlled their spaceship. To control the hardware, they had built-in machine code instructions using a compiler called Luminary. Here's how some of the code for the computer looked like when it was in Apollo 13 and 14. While it was handy, the Apollo guidance computer wasn't particularly powerful, having 64 kbytes of memory and an operating at 0.043 megahertz. In fact, it was less equipped than a modern toaster. A pocket calculator. So take a pocket calculator, or maybe a calculator you have on your smartphone. It has more computing power than the computers we use for the moon mission. Back on Earth at the Goddard Space Flight Center, thousands of flight technicians and computer experts employed the IBM System 360 Model 75 mainframe computer to make independent computations and maintain communication between Earth and lunar landers. These computers cost $3.5 million apiece and were the size of a car. Each could perform several 100,000 addition operations per second, and their total memory capacity was in a megabyte range. Programs are developed for the 75s that monitored the spacecraft's environmental data and astronauts' health, which were all time the most complex software ever developed. Today, even a simple USB stick or Wi-Fi router is more powerful, let alone an iPhone. An iPhone uses a 6 Apple-designed 64-bit Cortex-A8 ARM architecture composed of approximately 1.6 billion transistors. It operates at 1.4 gigahertz and can produce instructions at the rate of approximately 1.2 instructions every cycle of each of its two cores. That's 3.6 billion instructions per second. Put simply, the iPhone 6's clock is 32,600 times faster than the best Apollo era computers could perform instructions, and 120,000. Wait a minute, that might be 120 million times faster. You wouldn't be wrong in saying that an iPhone could be used to guide 120 million Apollo era spacecraft to the moon all at the same time. To be fair, though, these sorts of comparisons aren't very honorable. It's like making side-by-side comparison between the first airplane designed by the White brothers and an F-18 Hornet. Sure, both could fly, but the two are technologically worlds apart. After all, the iPhone clearly beats even one of the most famous, a supercomputer designed that ever existed, the IBM 1997 Deep Blue supercomputer, which beat Garry Kasparov in historic chess showdown. With this in mind, one can only awe at the kind of computer power each of us holds at its fingertips. Never mind we use them for frivolous matters. Imagine what you'd be holding in your hand or inside it 20 years from now. Now, just to say this, your mind, and the things that you do and the actions that it take and the impulses that it sends to just for, you to open your mouth, move your hand. There has to be things that are sent, and it has to be received and goes to the brain, then goes to the limb, and this all happens in milliseconds. Your brain outdoes any of the supercomputers there is. Our brains, our memories, our ability is like a supercomputer. They say every sight, taste, smell, touch, sound that we've experienced in our life is somewhere locked inside our hard drive in our brain. Now, what we can bring to instant memory, that's a different question, but it's all locked in our brain. Which is to say, antediluvian man needed no books. He needed no record keeping. He didn't need no writing. He didn't need things that we need today because of our poor, pitiful memories. Now we have to write down things in books. Mrs. White said antediluvian man would study not, we look at people now that have 25 years invested and they're a expert, a bachelor's degree, or there's something in a given thing, oceology, whatever their preferred astronomy, whatever their preferred area of expertise is, and we look at somebody who's dedicated 25 of the years of their life to a subject. These men had centuries to develop. They were masters of multiple subjects, multiple things. They did not need books, pencils, papers to put down records because all the records were contained in their brains. So all the birth records, death records, marriage records, all things were handed down from generation to generation to generation. And it wasn't until after the flood that most people had to come to the conclusion, hey, I got to start writing something down because these things aren't so easy to remember. So I just thought that was kind of interesting that because this was the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11, so I thought I would share that with you. We're going to go to our SRN News break, and we will be back after the news.
With SRN News, I'm Keith Peters in Washington. President Trump is denying Iran's claim that it has arrested 17 CIA recruits.
An Iranian intelligence official says the recruits were all Iranian nationals arrested over the past months for spying on the Islamic Republic's nuclear and military sites.
That's totally a false story. That's another lie.
The report comes amid rising tensions between the nations over the president pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. Asked if Washington's closer to a deal or armed conflict, he says Iran doesn't know which way it's going and continues disrespecting the U.S.
Frankly, it's getting harder for me to want to make a deal with Iran.
And says it could easily go either way. Sagar Magani, Washington.
President Trump is not happy about Special Counsel Robert Mueller's scheduled testimony before Congress this week.
On Twitter, the president describes Mueller as highly conflicted and says he should not be given another bite at the apple following his 2-year investigation. He says in the end, it will be bad for him and the phony Democrats in Congress, who he describes as having done nothing but waste time on this ridiculous witch hunt. The president writes in all caps, "No collusion, no obstruction."
White House correspondent Greg Clugston. A cold front is headed to the East Coast, bringing thunderstorms and cooler temperatures to the region, but officials in New York City are still angry that Consolidated Edison shut down power during the heat wave to some neighborhoods in the city. Mayor Bill de Blasio on WABC TV.
Con Ed is very haughty about this. They don't give real answers, and they don't feel they have to. So I think it begs the question of whether a private company should continue to provide a service if they are not accountable to the public.
He accused Con Edison of making a conscious decision to shut down power in various neighborhoods. On Wall Street, the Dow by 18 points. The Nasdaq rose 58. The S&P advanced 8. Oil up to $56.09 a barrel. This is SRN News. One evangelical leader is concerned about efforts by liberals to pronounce the question of abortion settled.
In the Democratic Party, and increasingly in the entire pro-abortion side of the debate, the argument is we have to quickly move on. We simply have to say that this isn't debatable.
Dr. Albert Mohler of the Southern Baptist Convention.
The pro-life position has to be ruled morally out of bounds. Now, this means we're living in a world turned upside down, in which the defense of human life is now presented as an immoral act.
His comments come from his daily briefing at albertmohler.com. The World Jewish Council, or Congress, is applauding Argentina's move to declare Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. The announcement came on the 25th anniversary of the attack on a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, which killed 85 people and wounded hundreds more. WJC President Ronald Lauder described the declaration as a long-awaited and principled step. This is SRN News. Equifax would pay hundreds of millions of dollars under a proposal to settle a 2017 data breach that exposed the private information of nearly 150 million people.
The credit reporting agency would pay up to $700 million to settle with the Federal Trade Commission and others. The proposed settlement needs to be approved by the Federal District Court, Northern District of Georgia. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau coordinated its investigation with the Federal Trade Commission and attorneys general from across the U.S. The deal would include up to $425 million in monetary relief to consumers and a $100 million civil penalty. Mike Hempen, Washington.
The Trump administration is penalizing a Chinese company and its top executive for violating U.S. restrictions on dealing with Iran's oil industry. Oil exports are Iran's largest source of foreign income. More details at srnnews.com. I'm Keith Peters in Washington.
KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Matthew 5:9.
Every weekday on the Power of God, KPOG 102.9 FM, and live on webcast1live.com. Join us for a view from the pew. Should you be offended, provoked, triggered, intimidated, shocked, confused, or inspired to think independently, call our studio lines at 515-442-KPOG and join the conversation. After all, it's your voice we want to hear. The View from the Pew on KPOG and webcast1live.com. Weekdays from 4 to 6 on the Power of God.
And
run and run and run and run.
Now, here's today's host, Frank the Verse Thomas.
And it is Frank the Verse Thomas, and we're back with a View from a Pew. If you would like to get a hold of me and share your thoughts about the show, you can do so by using the Service Legends Talk text line, and you can do that by listening to these instructions.
We want to hear from you, so give us a call on the Service Legends Talk and text line, 515-442-5764. That's 515-442-KPOG.
And we do our show here at the...
Live from the Yellow Blue Studios, your home for the light from LED Lighting. This is KPOG Grimes, West Des Moines.
That's Yellow Blue Studios here at Jordan Crossing Church. We do our show every day, 4 to 6 p.m. All right, I want to share something with you today, and I'm going to lay something on you pretty heavy. As many of you know, I talk on this show often and frequent about Ellen White. And I talk to you about some of the things that she has written and some of the things that she has to say. I've suggested to you that she herself writes that she does not call herself a prophetess. She leaves that name to others. She simply called herself a messenger of God. And I've shared with you some of the things that she has written. Now, I want to talk a little bit about William Miller and what was called the Millerite movement. William Miller was born in 1782, and he died in 1849. So he died 4 years after the Great Disappointment of October the 22nd, 1844. He was an American religious enthusiast, leader of a movement called Millerism, Millerites, that sought to revive the belief that the bodily arrival or advent of Christ was imminent. Miller was a farmer, but he also held such offices as deputy sheriff, justice of the peace, and in the War of 1812, he served as captain of the 30th Infantry. After years of Bible study, he began to preach in 1831. He learned this in about 1819. He sat on it for about 10 years until 1829, and then he started sharing some of his views openly with some people around 1831. He began to preach in 1831 that the present world would end about the year 1843. He based his belief primarily on the passage in the book of Daniel 8:13 to 14, until 2300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. He published a pamphlet in 1833 and a book of lectures in 1836, the first of many publications. Principal organs of the Millerite movement were the Signs of the Times, the Midnight Cry. Miller estimated that between 50 and 100,000 believed in his views. When 1843 passed, some of his associates set the October 22nd, 1844 date of the Second Coming. This date brought the movement to a sharp climax. There's no historical foundation for the stories that the Millerites engaged in such fanatical excesses as ascending hills, housetops, and trees, and ascension robes. The last General Conference met in Albany, New York, April 1845. Belief in the imminence of the Advent was reinstated, but no date was set and no church organization created. There are two principal Adventist bodies today: the Advent Christian Church, organized in 1861, and the much larger body of Seventh-day Adventists, organized in 1863, and several small Adventist bodies. Who was William Miller? This is The Truth by Ellen White. He was American farmer, Baptist preacher. Now, notice, Baptist preacher. Ellen White was about 13 years old, give or take, when she went to the listen to William Miller speak. Ellen White came from the Methodist Church. No Seventh-day Adventists exists at this point. Seventh-day Adventist is not created until 1863, almost 20 years after the Millerite movement and disappointment in 1844. But he was a Baptist preacher, taught the coming of Christ around 1844. He founded the popular movement known as the Millerites. In the War of 1812, he served as a captain. He returned to after the war, he returned to his farm in Lowhampton, New York, where he hoped to live quietly as a farmer, along with being a justice of the peace. Now, I am to understand from another Wikipedia that Miller may have been a member of Freemasonry. But in 1816, which would have been, he converted to Christianity, so he started focusing about 1819. He came to his basic beliefs in 1819. And he sat on those beliefs for about 10 years before he started talking about them to some friends, and around 1829, and then he started kind of preaching about it 1831-ish. His skeptical friends, mostly deists, challenged him, which led to an orderly study of the Bible beginning with Genesis. He wrote that with any obscure text, he would compare it to all the collateral passages with the help of Cruden's Concordance until he could harmonize these passages. With serious approach to Bible study, he began to study the prophecies that led him to the conclusion that he was living in the last period of Earth's history, specifically focused on the prophecies of Daniel, and unto 2,300 days then saw the sanctuary be cleansed. After further study, he concluded in 1818, about 25 years later in 1843, that the affairs of the present state would be wound up. In the next 5 years, he examined all objections to his reasoning, but became even more convinced. He excused himself as not a public speaker, but certain circumstances led him to the pulpit anyway, and his life would be forever changed. People throughout New England thronged to his meetings. Leading pastors called for his services. He published thoughts in public lectures, which extended his popularity from 1834 to 1839. His record book list included 800 lectures accomplished at his own expense and wholly in response to direct invitations. In 1839, when Joshua Himes, pastor in Boston, heard Miller preach, he immediately launched a publication called Signs of the Times. From then on, Millerism was more than a one-man activity. Many prominent preachers and scholars joined Miller. This was a movement of a lot of people, Methodists, Presbyterians. There was a lot of people looking forward to the coming of Christ. Now, let me share with you just a little bit out of Wikipedia. Miller, February 15, 1782 to December 20, 1849, he was an American Baptist preacher credited with the beginning of the 19th century North American religious movement known as Millerism. After his proclamation of the Second Coming did not occur as expected in the 1840s, new eras of his message emerged, including Advent Christians 1860 and Seventh-day Adventists 1863 and other Adventist movements. Shortly after, Miller rejected his Baptist heritage and became a deist. In his biography, Miller records his conversion. I become acquainted with the principal man in the village who were professedly deists. They were good citizens. They put into my hands the works of Voltaire, David Hume, Thomas Paine, Ethan Allen, and other deist writers. Like I said, his religious life, he converted, about 1813. He started talking about, he started coming to his basic beliefs in the movement that would lead down to 1844, and he sat on that information for about 10 years. Following his conversion, Deist's friends soon led him and challenged him to justify his newfound faith. He did so by examining the Bible closely, declaring to one friend, if he would give me time, I would harmonize all his apparent contradictions to my own satisfaction, or I will be a deist still. Miller was an active Freemason until 1831. Miller resigned his Masonic membership in 1831, stating that he did so to avoid fellowship with any practice that may be incompatible with the Word of God among Masons. By 1833, he wrote in a letter to his friends to treat Freemasonry as they would any other evil. So, like I said, they kind of dated the time in early 1843. They moved it to early 1844 and then redone their mathematics and come to would conclude with what would be called the Day of Atonement, which would occur 10 days after the trumpets was blown on, say, the 1st of October. So it would be roughly the 15th, and then 7 days after the 15th would be the Feast of Tabernacles, and then that's where they concluded their date settled on their date of October the 22nd, 1844. Miller was very disappointed when the Lord didn't return in 1844. In August 1844 at a camp meeting, Samuel Snow presented a message that became known as the Seventh Month Message, or True Midnight Cry, in a discussion based on scriptural typology. Snow presented his conclusion that the Lord would return on the 10th day of the 7th month, the present year, 1844, again largely based on the calendar of the Jews. This was determined to be October the 22nd, 1844. After the failure of 1844, the date became known as the Millerites' Great Disappointment. Our fondest hopes and expectations were blasted, and such a spirit of weeping care come over us I had never experienced. We wept and wept and wept till the day dawned. Now, the reason why I want to lay some of that groundwork is I want to share this with you. As you know, Mrs. Ellen White is integral to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She started attending Millerites meetings when she was approximately 13 to 14 years old. The movement, for all intents and purposes, ended in 1844, and Ellen White had her, so October of 1844, Ellen White had her first vision in December of 1844, about a month after the Great Disappointment. So Ellen White writes in her early writings this, and I want to share this with you. But first let me say that Mrs. White said in earlier writings that I had written, or earlier things that I've said on the radio, that she said if the people after the Great Disappointment of 1844 would have remained hot, the Lord would have came soon after that disappointment. But I had never read or understood what she meant by the word soon. I now think I know what soon means. In reading early writings on Sabbath, I come across this and I will share it with you. This is from Mrs. White, Early Writings, page 257, 258. After the Great Disappointment in 1844, Satan and his angels were busy engaging in laying snares to unsettle the faith of the body. He affected the minds of the persons who had experienced the message, who had the appearance of humility. Some pointed to the future for fulfillment of the first and second messages, while others pointed far back in the past, declaring that they had all been fulfilled. These were gaining influence over the minds of the inexperienced and unsettled their faith. Many were searching the Bible to build up a faith of their own, independent of the body. Satan exulted in this, for he knew that all those who broke loose from the anchor he could affect by different errors and drive about the diver winds of doctrine. Many who had led in the first and second messages now denied them, and there were a division and confusion throughout the body. My attention was then called to William Miller. He looked perplexed, and he was bowed with anxiety and distress for his people. The company that had been united and loving in 1844 were losing their love, opposing one another, and falling into a cold, backslidden state. As he beheld this, grief wasted his strength. I saw leading men watching him, and fearing lest he should receive the third angel's message and the commandments of God, as he would lean towards the light from heaven, the men would lay some plan to draw his mind away. A human influence was exerted to keep him in darkness and retain his influence from among those who opposed the truth. At length, William Miller raised his voice against the light from heaven. He failed in not receiving the message which would have fully explained his disappointment and cast light and glory on the past. He would have revived his exhausted energies, brightened his hopes, and led him to glorify God. By age, he was not accountable as those who kept him from the truth. They are responsible, and the sin rests upon them. You see, what William Miller, and I'll have to step back just a bit to mention that William Miller's basic issue is that he never fully, totally understood the third angel's message. He understood the first and second message, but he never understood the third. And this was his problem. So, says here, to finally conclude what I want to say here, if William Miller could have seen the light of the third angel's message, many things which looked dark and mysterious to him would have been explained. But his brethren professed so deep love and interest for him that he thought he could not tear away from them. His heart would incline towards the truth, and then he looked at his brethren that opposed it. Could he tear away from those who had stood side by side with him in proclaiming the coming of Jesus? He thought they surely would not lead him astray. So here's the important part here that you just... God suffered Miller to fall under the power of Satan and the dominion of death. So Miller apostatized from the movement. And God hid him away in the grave from those who were constantly drawing him from the truth. Moses erred as he was about to enter the promised land. Now, do you understand what I'm about to tell you here? Moses struck the rock twice, which he was only instructed the one time to smite the rock for water to come forth, and Moses had every reason to be frustrated with those people and their rebellious, stiff-necked attitude, but he disobeyed God in hitting that rock a second time. That caused him to not be able to enter the promised land. So, I, Ellen White, saw that William Miller erred as he was soon to enter the heavenly promised land, in suffering his influence to go against the truth. Others led him to do this, others must account for it, but angels watch the precious dust of this servant, and he will come forth at the sound of the last trump. All right. Do you hear what I'm saying? Mrs. White said that I have shared with you on a number of occasions that if the Millerite movement after the Great Disappointment had remained hot, God would have come soon after. I now know how soon. He would have came in William Miller's natural lifetime. Now, Miller was born in 1782, and he died December 20th, 1849. That means William Miller died 5 years after the Great Disappointment of 1844. He was 67 years old when he died. What I'm about to tell you is mind-blowing. I'm going to suggest to you right here and right now, the soon means God would have come before William Miller's natural death. God allowed him to come under the bondage of Satan and under dominion of the grave to save him, because he was being torn and ripped apart by the friends that he thought he needed to remain loyal to, who were trying to divert his ideas from ever focusing in on the third angel's message. So God allowed him to die. But had God allowed him to live, William Miller is 67 years old. He's got maybe another 30 years left in him, which would put it at 1879. 1879. So just let me tell you what my family tree is. My great-grandma was born in 1880. My grandmother was born in 1900. My dad was born in 1935. I was born in 1957. If God comes prior to 1880, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my father, or I don't exist. And that is perfectly A-OK with me. We would not have seen World War I, World War II. We would not have seen Nazi Germany and the concentration camps, which killed 6 to 8 million Jews. We wouldn't have seen the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, and much less 2019. God would have come years ago had the Millerite movement stayed hot. I'm driving into the studio today on 235 headed west. And I'm looking at the bridges and the infrastructure and the things that I'm going under as I'm driving. I'm looking at the cars around me. I'm looking at the freeway. I'm looking at the 4 lanes of highway or the freeway that I'm driving on, and I'm saying to myself, this should not exist. Air travel would not have existed. Car travel would not have existed. Space travel would not have existed. In 1969, there would have been no Sharon Tate for Charles Manson and his cohorts to plunge a knife into and carve their wickedness on her body. Everything we've known in the 20th century would not have existed if the Millerite movement would have stayed hot. The Titanic wouldn't have sunk. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in My grandfather on my mother's side was born in 1912, my grandmother 1916, and my mother 1938. My mother, my father, my grandparents on my mother's side and on my father's side would not have existed. None of this would exist. The Kennedy assassination wouldn't have happened. Everything we have known, it's been, it's roughly been, 175 years, roughly. I'm, 1844, 2019. I think it's roughly been 175 years since the Great Disappointment. We wouldn't have seen the Civil War. There's a possibility we wouldn't have seen the Civil War. There's a possibility we wouldn't have seen slavery. You know, the Civil War kicked up in 1860, 61, 62 to 65. The Adventist Church started in 1863. There is the possibility that within 20 to 30 years of the Millerite movement, Christ would have returned. Now, I want to say something about and I got to get to Sabbath school lesson here pretty quick, but I want to say something about what we know as what we call the Industrial Revolution that came in about 1830. And that was the ink pen, ballpoint pen, telephone, telegraph, locomotive. These were things that came on the scene in the 1830s, and it was what spawned is what we call the Industrial Revolution. That was the kickoff point of the Industrial Revolution. And obviously the car travel, the airplane travel, the space travel, and everything we know today with our cell phone in our hand that's millions of times smarter than what it took to land Apollo 11 on the moon. None of this would exist if Christ had came. But in 1844, we moved into what is called the Laodicean Church. The lazy, apathetic church. And I would suggest to you every decade that has passed since 1830, 1840, 50, 60, 70, 80, 1900, 1910, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and now 80, 90, 2000, and now we're in 2000, almost 2020. All those decades that have passed since the 1844 movement, and starting in 1830, technology has increased and abounded each and every decade, maybe doubled what it was the decade before, until we literally have a smartphone in our hand that is millions of times smarter than what it took to put the Apollo 11 landing on the moon. But along with technology increasing, every decade since 1830, lazy, lukewarm, apathetic Christianity increases decade after decade. I had a friend of mine tell me this week, his daughter had a disease where told her she shouldn't have any kids and she should adopt. So they adopted a young kid here about 16, 17, 18 years ago. My friend's telling me how this kid just don't want to listen to his parents anymore. Don't want to do what anybody tells him. Just becoming rebellious. And focused on self. This is the millennial generation. And my friend said the kid has been handed everything. His car's paid for, his insurance is paid for by the parents. He's had smartphones, he's had computers, he's had clothes, he's had money, he's had everything put in his lap, and he's becoming rebellious and becoming belligerent and doesn't want to mind, doesn't want to take orders. This is the rebellious generation. This is the rebellion. This is the millennial generation. They've been handed everything. We're in full-blown apathy and lukewarm. In 2019, we are as full-blown apathetic and lukewarm as it can get. But it's been steadily increasing each and every decade from the start of the Industrial Revolution in 1830, because the more we have, the more advantage we have. We no longer carry wood. We no longer carry water. We no longer have to wash our clothes down at the brook. We now have washers and dryers and things to take care of our clothes. We have heat, we have air, we have things, we have four-wheel drive, we have phones, we have TVs, all the technology at our fingertips. Who had time to worry about what gender they were in 1830? Who had time to worry about their feelings that they might be trapped in another body in 1830? You just didn't have time to worry about it because you had to carry firewood. You had to put up hay for the animals. You had to stock up firewood. You had to can and preserve foods to make it through the winter. You had too much work to do to worry about what gender you were. Do you see where we're at in 2019 from where we were in 1830? That we just have too much time on our hands. We have too much leisure. Christ could have came then had we been on fire. And he could have came any decade since if we would just be on fire for the Lord as a body of Christ. We could have seen it in the 50s. We could have seen it in the 60s. We could have seen it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the thousands. And now. We could have seen God at any point in the last 175 years. Whose fault is it he hasn't come? It's our lazy, apathetic, lukewarm attitude towards the Lord, and it's getting worse each and every day we're alive, because each generation since 1830 has had more time on their hands. Now we worship at the altar of our sexual identity. But now I know what soon means. I just wanted to share that with you. Now we will get to our Sabbath school lessons, and I'm going to go through these pretty quick. Memory text for Sabbath: defend the poor and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and the needy, deliver the poor and needy, free them from the hand of the wicked. Psalms 82, 3-4. Psalms and Proverbs depicts the experience of living with God in the common things of life, not just for the times of worship or in other religious activities, while the books of Proverbs offer a range of practical wisdom from relationships and families to business and government. The Psalms are a collection of songs that cover a variety of emotions and spiritual experiences, from laments to exultant praise and to everything in between. I say it's usually David begging God to get him out of a jam, and then praising God that God got him out of a jam, is basically the Psalms in context. It's easy to see that our faith should make a difference in every aspect and experience of our lives, because God cares about every aspect. Meanwhile, any reflection on life in this fallen world could hardly ignore the injustice that so permeates the human condition. In fact, injustice is repeatedly described as something that our Lord cares about and seeks to relieve. It is He who is the hope of the hopeless. Though we can only touch what these books say about the topic, perhaps this lesson might inspire you to be more proactive in ministering to the needs of the poor, the oppressed, and the forgotten who exist all around us and whom we are obligated to help. Sunday, Songs of Hope for the Oppressed. As already noted, God sees and hears people who are in distress and in trouble. Most often in the Psalms, we hear from those cries from people who have trusted in God but are seeing injustice done. The affirmations of the goodness, justice, and power of God can seem overwhelmed by injustice and oppression that the voices in these songs experience or observe. Yet these songs are songs of those who are still singing. Neither their life or their faith has been quenched. There's still hope, and the urgency for God to act. The urgency is for God to act before it's too late, before evil triumphs, before the oppressor are destroyed by the weight of evil brought against them. In this way, the writers of the Psalms are trying to bridge the gap between the affirmations of their faith and the trials and tragedies of their life. Psalms 9:7-9 says, "But the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness, and he judges people with unrighteousness. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in the times of trouble." And then Psalms 9:13-20, "Be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me. Lift me up from the gates of death, that I may recount your praises in the gates of the daughter of Zion, that I may rejoice in your salvation. The nations have sunk in the pit that they made, in the net they hid. Their own foot has been caught. The Lord himself made known. He's executed judgment, and the wicked are snared in the work of their own hands. The wicked shall return to Sheol, and all the nations that forget God, for the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put fear in them, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men." Pardon me. Can you imagine the circumstances David, the writer of Psalm, was in? Can you feel the tension between his faith in God's goodness and the present experience? How have you dealt with the struggle of faith in God amidst the times of severe trial? I guess my biggest doubts come, I know God's in control. Sometimes I doubt whether he cares for what's going on in my particular life, because I'm just a small grain of sand in this greater will that he has for the world. And does he take the time to really focus on what I need? That's where I have sometimes I've never doubted, for the most part, that God is God. I've never ever thought I was ever close to being an agnostic or an atheist. I've never felt like God didn't exist. I've always believed in God. I've got faith to believe that he is God, and I believe that he's going to come again, and I believe that I'm saved. I just sometimes wonder if he cares what's going on in my life right now. You know, I had a limb blown down back when Dave Hodson was still with us, probably last summer. Dave drove by the house and seen it, and he said, "That's not a limb, that's a tree." So that's a pretty good sized limb. I haven't got that thing all cut up. I still have remnants of that I need to cut. Well, Saturday we had a storm blow up, and it blew some more tree limbs out of the trees for me. So Sunday I gets up thinking I'm going to go out and take out a little bit of recycling. I'm going to ponder whether I'm going to cut grass or not. And I walk out into the backyard to find tree limbs down, and I got to jump into immediate action and start trying to saw stuff up and get it on the burn pile. I'm not done recouping from the last tree limb that blew down, so sometimes I just wonder, God, do I need this at this point in my life? Everything I got going on in my life, do I need this? I spent 3 hours in the yard just to get the yard clean enough to cut the grass. For the privilege of going out and cutting the grass, I had to do 3 hours of work just to get the grass cut. Throughout Psalms, the repeated answer to this tension is the hope and promise of God's good and just judgment. Evil and justice may seem to triumph for now, but God will judge the evildoers and the unjust. They will be punished, while those who they have hurt and oppressed will be restored and renewed. C.S. Lewis describes this initial surprise at the excitement for longing for God's judgment as expressed repeatedly in Psalms, observing that many Bible writers today consider judgment something to be feared. He considers the original Jewish perspective and writes, thousands of people who have been stripped of all they possess and have been the right who have the right entirely on their side to be the last heard. Of course, they're not afraid of judgment. They know their case is unanswerable if they could only be heard. They know their case is unanswerable if only they could be heard. When God comes to judge, at last it will. In Psalms, we see the hope for the oppressed, even now amid their present sufferings and disappointments. What reasons do we have to view the idea of judgment as a positive and not to be feared? Because if we're on the side of the Lord, we welcome it. We want this controversy settled. We want Christ's name vindicated. We want Christ to rule, and we want to rule with him as his heir, as his son or his daughter, as his heir to the throne. We want to rule alongside God. We don't fear judgment. Now to today's lesson, Monday. Do something, will you? Do something, God, please. Here's Psalms 82, 1-8. God has taken his place in divine counsel. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long, God, will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are my gods. Sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men ye shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all nations. This verse is claiming justice for the downtrodden and the poor and the needy. And how long will you show partiality to the wicked? You ever felt like that? God, do something. What's the message to us here? Despite the ordering and the rules of society that God gave to them, at various times in their history, the Israelite nation failed to live up to his plan. Too easily they become like nations living around them, living by a pattern of injustice and oppression. Leaders and judges only looked after themselves, and their favor could be purchased by bribes. Without courts to protect them, ordinary people and the poor especially were subject to exploitation. Psalms 82, in a response to such a situation, it describes God's role as supreme judge, and it depicts a scene in which he judges the leaders and even the judges of the people. The psalm emphasizes that those who fill such roles in society are appointed to act as judges under him. Comes from Ellen White's Prophets and Kings, page 198. They hold their position and conduct their work as representatives and subordinates for God. In the psalmist's view, the justice of God is a model for how earthly justice should function, and it also provides a measure against which such justice or injustice and those who dispense it will be judged. The psalm concludes with a specific call for God to act. Arise, O God, judge the earth already, for you shall inherit all nations. And I insert the already. How many times have you just cried out to God, say, come on, God, do something, would you? How much longer do we have to put up with this? but it's a call to God to act and to intervene and to stop the injustice that's so prevalent in the nation. Like many of the other Psalms, this one gives a voice to the voiceless and to the oppressed and those whose voices who have been silenced by the unjust systems in which they live and work. Psalms 82 makes an appeal to God in his position of supreme judge and sovereign ruler of the universe and of all the nations. There's no higher court or authority in the land to which such appeal could be made. The assurance comes that when earthly courts do not hear or uphold the cries of the poor and oppressed, which is so often the case here, there is still an undeniable opportunity to call out for help. At different times in our lives, we might find ourselves as victims of injustice. But other times, we might be the one committing or profiting from injustice. In such passages as Psalms 82, we can find insight and wisdom, whether we are oppressed or the oppressor. God is concerned for the unjust judges too, describing them as his children and wanting them to choose to live better. I said, you are God's sons of the Most High, all of you. So these men were put in positions to judge, and maybe they give unfavorable treatment to the poor and the downtrodden, and with bribes, the wicked seem to come out, they step in a bucket of poo, and they come out smelling like a rose, as the old saying goes. Thus, there's hope even for those on the wrong side of oppression, if they will allow themselves to be changed. You ever feel like that? I felt like that when I walked out Sunday and I looked in my backyard, and it wasn't a terribly hot day, but it was fairly humid. And as I started working this 61-year-old heart with a bow saw, sawing off the smaller branches to stack on the brush pile to maybe be burned in the fall time, I put my work in my heart. I put my heart to good work that day. I put my arm to good work that day, working my left and my right both, switching off with the bow saw to get these branches cut, and I mean I was spent when I came in to sit down and eat. And the whole time I'm out there cutting up these branches, I'm just thinking, God, for real? For real? I need this at this point in my life, everything I got going on in my life. Are you kidding me? I still have some debris I need to cut up with a chainsaw from the last tree limb that blew down. Now I got another 3 smaller limbs that blew down. And as I said, I worked approximately 3 hours just to have the privilege of cutting the grass, to get the yard cleaned up and rake the sticks up so that I'm not mowing over tree debris with my mower. You feel like sometimes, I once heard Cody Lundeen and Dave Canterbury and A Dual Survival say something to the effect that Cody's a part-time philosopher and says something to the effect that nature's just pardon me. Nature's a given. It's not your friend, it's not your enemy. Are you going to work with the forces of nature in your behalf, or are you going to let the forces of nature work against you on your behalf? You just kind of got to take nature as a given. It's not my friend, it's not my enemy. But I'm thinking the whole time as the humid sweat is running down my brow into my eyes and trying to keep my eyes from burning, as I saw I'm thinking of that curse pronounced on Adam in the garden, by the sweat of your brow and thorns and thistles you will grow. It's times like that when I just go, God, come today. If I never see another tree limb blow down in my life, if I never ever cut another blade of grass, if I never do another thing in my life, come today. Mrs. White says if you don't get up every day of your life and pray to God, Lord, come today, you don't love the Lord. But wait a minute, verse, some of my family ain't ready. Should I really be praying for the Lord to come? Yeah. And spend your time, instead of watching stupid TV, playing your stupid video games, drinking your beer, going out and blowing off fireworks, doing all the crap we waste time on, start focusing on the family and making sure those people that aren't walking in Jesus Christ start hearing the message from your lips. Because we can go home. We should have been home years ago. If we just reached 120 years that Noah preached after 1844, that lands in 1964. That's the year my brother's born. That's just after the Kennedy assassination and the Cuban Missile Crisis. World shouldn't have existed past 1844. If you give the 40 years that the children wandered around the wilderness they shouldn't have, and they should have walked right into the promised land, tack on 40 more years on top of 1964, and you come up with 2004. The Twin Towers falling in 2001. Now we're 15 years post 2004, and we're still here in 2019, rolling on 2020. And Mrs. White said no sooner did he want to take him into the promised land than he wants to take us home now. Whose fault is it? Well, I'll just let you know, friend, it ain't God's. So this has been Frank the Verse Thomas, and we will see you here again tomorrow at View from a Pew. And find my cart here so I can just let you know that you've been listening to Frank the Verse Thomas here at View from a Pew, and that is being heard on KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes, West Des Moines.
KPOG 102.9 FM, Grimes.